is a fireside chat with Inderpal Bhandari with IBM. So a little bit about Inderpal before he joins us on our virtual stage. Inderpal was one of the first to hold the title of Chief Data Officer and rejoined IBM as Global Chief Data Officer in December 2015. In this newly created role, he has leveraged his extensive experience to lead the development of IBM's data strategy and drive IBM's internal cognitive enterprise transformation. The work has culminated in the Cognitive Enterprise Blueprint, a roadmap for IBM's clients on their own journeys to cognition. Inderpal is an expert in transforming data into business value and improved customer experiences by delivering strategic, innovative capabilities that use analytic insights to enable growth and productivity. So we'll be chatting with Inderpal about becoming truly data-driven, altering the organizational mindset. And I will tell you, we are very excited and honored to have you joining us here. Inderpal, thank you so much for joining us at this event. I would love to jump right into the first question so that everyone can hear from you today. And we're gonna start with something very broad, if you will. But this will certainly allow us to transition smoothly into some follow-up questions. You have been at the forefront of using data to create business value. As one of the first chief data officers around the world, what have been some of your biggest lessons learned as chief data officer?
Wow. Yeah, no, I think we could pretty much spend the whole conversation on that question. First off, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Welcome, everybody. As Charlene mentioned, when I first became Chief Data Officer in 2006, there were only 4 of us globally. And by that, I mean all the other related and associated positions as well: Chief Analytics Officer, Chief Transformation Officer, Chief Digital Officer, only 4 of us globally. I'm actually the last person standing of that original 4. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it has allowed me to grow with the profession and also to learn the craft as we go through. So in terms of lessons learned, what I will do is I will touch on a few lessons from my tenure over the course of the 4 companies where I've actually created this organizational capability of the data office. And in some cases, it was done as just Chief Data Officer. In many cases, it was Chief Data and Analytics Officer. In other cases, Chief Data and AI Officer. So essentially, I'll draw from those experiences and I'll outline maybe 3 or 4 lessons that I learned. Let me first start with the very first lesson. Has to do with understanding what a Chief Data Officer does, and specifically the interplay between business strategy and data strategy. You know how that's played out. So in one of my jobs, the company had come up with a brand new operating model when I joined, and they essentially said, "Your job is to prove to Wall Street that this is better than what our competitors do." So, pretty much cast along the traditional line of get data, do analysis, etc. And we did that. We could actually show that the new operating model was better. It performed better in terms of outcomes for the clients. But frankly, nobody really cared. When we brought it forward to the clients, they said, "This is great. This is what we pay you to do." And so obviously from a Wall Street standpoint, that would make no difference then, right? Because how is it going to move the company forward in terms of its top line, bottom line, et cetera? It's missing. Then we went to clients and, the bigger clients, and they agreed to do some pilots to demonstrate. But again, it came back to the same conclusion. This is what we pay you to do. This is great, but that's exactly why we pay you to do this. When it finally took off, was when we came up with a new product that had to do with guaranteeing the performance of this new operating model versus the old operating models. We actually guaranteed it and said, if it doesn't perform better, we're going to write you a check. And then that's, as you can imagine, a whole new product line, right? Underwriting the guarantees, essentially laying them out, working with consultants, et cetera, et cetera. But that's when it primarily just took off. And if you think about it, it also enhanced the business strategy of the company, because the business strategy of the company was, we're going to use this new operating model. In the data office, playing back and forth with the business, essentially arrived at the refined business strategy, which was, we will use this new operating model and underwrite it to differentiate from the competition, win business, etc. So that was one lesson in terms of how you kind of play back and forth between the business strategy and the data strategy to drive things forward. Another lesson that I learned had to do about people, culture, and how that's a really, really hard problem to solve. And of course, it takes different flavors depending on what you're doing. But in one of my jobs, I was part of this $100 billion merger. And my responsibility was to bring the data and analytics systems and organizations together. And as often happens with such mergers, not the most rational decisions are made as there's so much going on, right? So what ended up happening for one reason or another was the systems of one company were retained, but the people of the other company were primarily retained and the others were let go. And you can kind of imagine just what a maelstrom this created from a cultural standpoint and how much dysfunction. But I had to get this thing done. Eventually, what ended up happening was, because I kind of realized that people were, one side said, we're the acquirers, you got to listen to us. The other side said, no, we know the systems, you don't, we're right. And eventually, the way that problem got solved was we created a brand new product. And then I could point to that and said, we're not going, east or west in terms of what the old companies were doing, but we're going north in terms of this new direction. And then that generated the excitement. People got together. Then as they started truly working together, that fostered trust and everything moved forward. So that's another major lesson that I learned in terms of just the cultural aspects and how they play out, albeit that's an extreme case, because you had two major companies coming together. But I will guarantee you, in every job that you do that has the CDO role, there will be a key aspect of culture, and that'll make it, that will be probably one of the most difficult things that you'll do. Do I have time for a couple more? Or do you want to move on to the next question?
The next one I have is about 2020, so I thought I'd pop in and see if we could move on, Inderpal.
Sure.
Given 2020 was a year of unprecedented turbulence and change, how have your priorities changed, and what are you focused on, I guess, for the remainder of 2021?
Yeah, so in fact, that's a great question, because one of the lessons I was going to talk about was a 2020 lesson with the pandemic. What we've been doing at IBM is essentially infusing AI into all our workflows, all our processes, etc. And then the pandemic hits, and you can kind of imagine what that does. I mean, in a sense, what ended up happening was all the models that one had developed were, in some sense, not quite ready for what actually happened, right? It was a brand new situation, novel situation, not much data available around it. Whatever AI models, et cetera, one had in terms of the world prior to that were different. They just, there was a different world, and so the data was different. Eventually, what we ended up realizing that the key thing that had to be done was to go back to the basics. So as with any of these systems, whether you're talking AI or large-scale analytics, et cetera, eventually it comes down to the data. And so we recognized that what we needed to do was to provide data in as real-time a sense as we could, so that decision makers could make decisions, even if they weren't really using the models. At least they could use their own knowledge to apply to that data. So for instance, by way of example, with regard to our entire supply chain, if you overlaid the incidence of COVID on where our suppliers were, then the people who work our supply chain could make very informed judgments. If you overlaid the incidence of COVID as they unfolded on our customer locations, again, the people who work in the finance area, work in the sales area, etc., could again make judgments as to what to do and what not to do. So it came back to this notion that eventually it's all about getting the data out there as cleanly, as accurately, and as quickly as possible. That was kind of another major lesson learned there. So that became obviously one of the focuses that we are continuing with post 2020 into 2021. Another big change was the focus on people, because everybody was working remotely, everybody was affected. Remember, we went through, the pandemic, then there was unrest, right? Then basically racial issues, etc. So as a global organization with people working remotely, I mean, what I recognized was we had to interact a lot more frequently with our people. And all the usual notions about, hierarchy and chain of command and all that stuff had to go out of the window. A lot more one-on-ones with people who ordinarily, I would not actually have talked with. So that was one major change that had to happen. A lot more interactions with regard to all hands, completely open and transparent Q&A with the employees. We just became very clear that the biggest asset of the company are the employees, and at a time like this, you have to really nurture them, and that's another one that we're going to continue with that focus through 2021. The other aspects that came through is there's just a very intense focus in the market on digital transformation, and prior to the pandemic, people would question, right? I mean, people who write the big checks and so forth would question the need, and now there is no real question like that. It's all about execution. So there's an intense interest in the market to move forward with that. You'll find a lot more workloads now actually beginning to move into essentially scenarios that enable doing work digitally, interacting with clients digitally, and so forth. And that's why the focus on our hybrid cloud and AI, those approaches have become front and center for us in 2021.
Perfect, thank you. Wanted to ask you, when looking at the Chief Data Office from a business perspective, what are the CEOs and other members of the C-suite looking for? Perhaps this is a $1 million question, Inderpal.
Yeah, so I'll give you my sense of this, right? Having done this 4 times, there are 3 things primarily that the C-suite is looking for from a chief data officer. One is, help me grow my top line. So it's the top line growth. The second one is help me improve my bottom line. So that's operational efficiency. And the third one is help me reduce my risk, because data, there's so much risk centered around data. So, cybersecurity, privacy, all that stuff starts overlapping with the CDO role. And depending on the need of the day, the C-suite may define one's role by emphasizing one or more of those dimensions. So you'll kind of land somewhere in that grid with regard to those 3 items, but that's primarily what they're going to look to you for. I think the other things that they will do also is, because in this role, one of the, things change so fast. It's such a dynamic profession, right? So when I started out, it was all around warehousing, analytics, and so forth. And now it's, all around AI and essentially RPA and, just cybersecurity, quantum computing. So they do expect that as the CDO, because when you start thinking in terms of the technologies and how rapidly they're evolving and changing, as well as the regulatory landscape, how quickly that's changing, they look to you to be abreast of all those trends, all those emerging trends, and to help educate the company. So that's the other one. I think that's kind of key that they look for. And if I had to summarize it all, I mean, like when I ask my boss, what is my role? He just has 2 words for it. He says, change agent. You're my main change agent. So that's what I expect you to do.
Well, that leads into the next question, which is why do enterprises care so much about risk?
So yeah, so risk is extremely important to large enterprises, and there's reputational risk, which if one loses the reputation and the brand suffers, that is going to have a dramatic impact on the business. There's also monetary risk. If there's a data breach or something like that, then there are huge fines and so forth that one could be subject to if one had not taken all the right steps to address those. And ditto with sensitive information, privacy, and just being able to respond to those events when they occur. Looking forward, it's going to become even more and more important because as more AI systems come into play, the use of AI in an ethical way is going to be critical. This was already true with regard to data and analytics. You've all heard the examples of the retailer where somebody's privacy rights were violated because they went off and sent a promotion for prenatal vitamins, and the person was a minor. It turned out to be true because they had been looking at the data. The whole issue is that you're looking at data to create more data. You kind of don't know upfront what you're going to end up creating, and that's where really there becomes an ethical aspect of this. And so with AI, that the stakes there have actually doubled. So I kind of expect that reputation is going to be tied to data as well as how one uses AI, and the transparency, explainability, and just the good citizenship that has to go with that use becomes increasingly important. So I think the CEOs are very, very aware of this. They're also keenly aware of the issues that surround the emerging trends as they move forward. And then correspondingly, on the dark side of this, you also have, just very sophisticated actors, in some cases state actors, that will go off and essentially pose cybersecurity threats, which have to be addressed. So it's a board level topic for most companies.
Well, security and privacy are top of mind of users, employees, companies, chief data officers. So how are you thinking about security and privacy, and what actions have you taken?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people in this audience are familiar with these, and they've been taking actions, I'm sure, around this front. So I'll focus on one or two aspects that I think are a little more counterintuitive, but are just increasingly more and more important. I think one's got to start thinking about the security and the privacy, not just from a enterprise standpoint, but actually the whole supply chain standpoint, because there are weaknesses in the supply chain that can be exploited. I mean, you saw the SolarWinds incident, but it also is that because if you're in a large enterprise, you pretty much, you literally have hundreds, thousands, just large numbers of suppliers and vendors and intermediaries that are sitting perhaps between yourself and the clients or other suppliers and so forth. And I think that is a huge aspect that needs to be addressed as we move forward. So in our case, we kind of think of establishing an enterprise-wide compliance baseline. And by enterprise-wide, I'm including our supply chain of suppliers as well, not just the thousands of systems and so forth that, and our own people that are part of it, but essentially the supply chain that we end up using as well to address those kinds of concerns, which I think is going to be, it's going to come more and more to the forefront.
Wonderful. Thank you, Inderpal. Another question I have here is, can you lay out some of the steps needed to infuse AI successfully in the organization? In other words, can you briefly describe a basic roadmap of the steps needed to get that done the right way?
Yeah. So I'll focus on, what you said. I mean, the roadmaps, sequential roadmaps and all that stuff, there are plenty of templates that people have put forward. We have a ladder to AI that we put forward. I'll kind of give you from an experiential aspect. The last part of your question, the right way, I'll focus on one aspect of the right way. When we talk about infusing AI into the enterprise, I put forward a blueprint. The blueprint is made up of four major dimensions. And the dimensions are, obviously data, technology, as one would expect, right? If you're going to use AI and you're going to use really sophisticated AI like deep learning, reinforcement learning, all those, those variations that are highly specialized, they draw upon specialized hardware, very, very fast interconnect to the data systems, just because experiments have to be run hundreds of thousands of times and so forth. So technology becomes a huge aspect of it as well. And then the other aspect is business process, because to truly infuse AI, you're no longer in a position where you're actually just serving up insights, looking at data. So, the old warehouse analytics, disseminate the insight model. But in this case, you've got to actually infuse AI into the workflow so that the workflow becomes intelligent. You kind of meet the decision maker where they are, and they're able to act on it in real time as things are happening, as they're unfolding. It's got to be in the moment like that. So the business process aspect is kind of key. And finally, a point that I touched on earlier, the organization and cultural aspects. And they show up because things like, you can't really just bring in a whole new workforce. You've got to retrain, re-educate your workforce so they become comfortable working with AI systems. Initially, if somebody hasn't done that, there's distrust. They think, am I going to lose my job? So the company's got to go that extra mile and make sure that people are retrained, they're educated. And it's also just very good business because, like I said, you can't just replace the whole workforce. You're much better off bringing in a small percentage of key leaders and then retraining everybody else. Besides, they're the ones who understand and know the most about the business process. You bring in somebody from the outside, even if they are, let's say part of procurement on the outside, be very different in terms of the business processes for procurement that are, say, at IBM. So bottom line is that those aspects come to play in a huge way with regard to moving forward with infusing AI. Now, the final point, the reason I bring those four up is because they have to move in lockstep. You let one get ahead of the other, and everything has basically comes to a stop. So that's the key insight with regard to doing it the right way.
Thank you, Inderpal. Moving on to our next question. How has the IBM CDO built a data-driven culture and made data accessible across the enterprise?
Yeah, so one of the things that we understood once it became clear that our mission is really about infusing AI into our business processes and having a central data and AI enablement platform that essentially enables the enterprise to do it. Once those aspects became clear, then it had to do with changing the culture, right? The data-driven culture, getting people to accept it, getting people to understand this. And I've touched on some of that with the examples on education, retraining, and so forth. But I'll pick on one or two aspects that are kind of interesting and counterintuitive. I think of working the culture in any possible direction that you can. So top down, that's the strategy piece, right? If you're really engaged with the business folks who are coming up with the strategy and executing it, and you're really a player and you're playing with them, there'll be that back and forth between the data strategy and the business strategy. So that's the top down piece. Then there is a peer-to-peer piece where you're dealing with, the key peers who will also help to make this successful. So for instance, the CIO, the CTO, the business leaders, the head of operations, these people all have to be playing nicely in the sandbox. So that's the peer-to-peer piece that has to be done. And finally, this is, I think, in fact, the most important one, the bottom-up piece. So in my area, I actually have a whole department that's dedicated towards, and they're fully empowered. If they find a like-minded team in another area, say in finance, and they can go off and infuse AI into our accounts receivable process without coming back to any of us for permission. They're fully empowered to do that. I will give you one stat to end this with. After 3 years or so, when we had this central data and AI enablement platform set up, we kind of hit 3 years into my tenure. So, maybe 1 year to strategy, 2 years set up, start use. We had 100,000 active users, people using the system at least every month. Of those 100,000, 15,000 were maybe top down, 85,000 were bottom up. That's how the culture changes, because that's how you actually get large numbers of people participating in it.
Thank you, Inderpal. I wanted to circle back. I have one more question, and we have an audience question that has just come in. But you had spoken a little bit throughout today's fireside chat about the people aspect. So I wanted to throw in this question to hear from you to talk a little bit more about the people aspect of the job or role of the CDO and other leaders in the data office. How important is that aspect as we move forward into 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, the people aspect, is just extremely key to what we have to do, especially with the way things have unfolded. I mean, employees today, I can guarantee you, employees had one mindset going in before the pandemic. Then we went all remote. Now, there's return to work, all that stuff is coming in. Everybody has a point of view. Each employee has a point of view on what they want to do or don't want to do with regard to work, family, the balance that they have to maintain. And everybody has much stronger points of view on this. They're not as accepting as before. And I think, from that stand, my view on this is you've got to just provide extreme flexibility there. If you value your employees, this is the time to provide that kind of flexibility and let them work that out almost on an individual basis. I mean, I know that's not always possible, but I think if that's the underlying philosophy, I think that's going to be very, very well received.
Thank you. I mean, very, very important. And I know you touched on it a few times today, so I wanted to make sure to squeeze that question in. We have one audience question, and we do have time for that, Inderpal. I would love to throw that in. This is from David. He's asking, can you discuss data lineage challenges of managing data quality and understanding data flows?
Yeah, so data lineage, is, and I'll give you some, I'll give it to you in kind of how this plays out in real life, right? So one of the things that I've seen, this happens in most companies that I started out working with, right, is you're in a major meeting in the business, you're talking about some business performance issue. It could be, financial, it could be sales related, it could be pipeline related, et cetera. And there's the analytics area puts forward a chart, the business area comes up with another chart. Turns out, both are right, except the lineage of the data in both cases is different. And there's no way to resolve it quickly, unless you're able to establish that the lineage is different. And you're unable to do that if you haven't actually done that work. So you keep having this back and forth, and you can just imagine the amount of inefficiency that introduces, because every business unit head is going to fight for their business, and they're going to put forward the best possible face they can on that business. And the corporate folks, the CFO and so forth, their job is stewards. They're going to look at this and say, they're going to try to poke holes in it. So it's extremely important to standardize some of the data. The data around finance that's being reported to the street, the data around your clients. When we talk about a major client, what are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about the global locations? Are we talking about the headquarters, et cetera? So some level of standardization has to be imposed across the enterprise. And for that, you've got to make sure you understand the lineage, and people are going to always use that particular lineage as they go forward and make these, have these discussions or throw out that data. That's how you arrive at trust across the organization. So very good question, extremely important topic.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Inderpal.